She walked into the room with quiet dignity, carrying nothing but her purse and the weight of her own history. To the officers, she was invisible, just another black woman they thought they could laugh at, dismiss, and disrespect. They didn't see her years of sacrifice, the nights spent studying law when the world told her she'd never succeed, or the battles she fought to stand in spaces few believed she belonged. Instead, they mocked her. They saw only what they wanted to see. Someone they thought was powerless. They didn't realize that the woman they were ridiculing held more authority than any of them in that room. They didn't know they were about to humiliate someone who carried one of the highest honors in the country, a federal judge. What happened next shattered their arrogance and exposed something much deeper than a single encounter. Because this wasn't just about one woman being underestimated. It was about centuries of bias, the constant struggle to be seen for who you are, and the devastating consequences of a society that judges first and asks later. So how did a moment of mockery turn into a lesson none of them would ever forget? And what does this story reveal about the world we live in today? Her mornings always began the same way, coffee in hand, neatly pressed suit, and a quiet confidence that came from years of hard work. She wasn't just respected in her field. She was a trailblazer, one of the few black women ever to hold such a powerful position in the federal courts. To those who knew her, she was more than a judge. She was a mentor, a mother, and a living reminder that resilience could break barriers. But outside those marble courtrooms, her reality was very different. In public spaces, in grocery stores, and even in her own neighborhood, she still carried the heavy weight of being underestimated. Strangers didn't see the title in front of her name. They didn't see the decades of brilliance and sacrifice. They only saw the color of her skin. On the day it happened, she wasn't stepping onto a bench or delivering a ruling. She was simply running errands, ordinary, everyday tasks like anyone else. But in that moment of normalcy, a storm was waiting. A group of officers crossed her path, and with them, the assumptions and prejudices that had shadowed her all her life. They thought they were looking at someone easy to dismiss, someone powerless. What they didn't realize was that the woman they were about to humiliate held more authority than any of them could imagine. And in just a few minutes, their laughter would turn into silence, and their silence into shame. The store was crowded that afternoon, the kind of place where voices echoed off tiled floors, and every sound seemed amplified. She moved through the aisles calmly, checking items off her list, blending into the background like anyone else. But not everyone saw her that way. Near the exit, a group of officers stood casually, their laughter sharp, cutting through the hum of the crowd. Their eyes followed her, their smirks growing with each step she took. She could feel it, the stares that lingered too long, the whispers meant to be overheard. At first, she tried to ignore it. She had dealt with this before. But this time was different. This time they weren't just watching. One officer nudged another, pointing in her direction. Their laughter grew louder. They muttered words under their breath, mocking her appearance, her presence, and the very fact that she dared to walk with pride. To them, she wasn't a respected figure, a federal judge. To them, she was just a black woman in the wrong place, at the wrong time. She clutched her purse tighter, her heart beating faster, not from guilt, but from anger. Should she confront them? Should she stay silent? Years of experience had taught her the cost of both. Every choice carried weight. Every move could be twisted against her. As she reached the counter, their voices grew bolder. "Move along," one said loudly, not to her directly, but enough for everyone nearby to hear. Another chuckled, shaking his head, as if her very presence was a joke. The customers around her shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting away, pretending not to notice. That silence, the silence of bystanders, cut deeper than the mockery itself. She steadied her breathing, reminding herself of who she was. She had stood before juries and had delivered rulings that shaped lives. Yet here, stripped of her robe and title, she was being reduced to nothing more than a target for ridicule. When she finally walked toward the door, the tension snapped. One officer stepped forward, blocking her path ever so slightly. Not enough to cause alarm, but enough to send a message. His grin was smug, his voice dripping with false authority. "Careful now," he said, as if warning her of something only he could see. The room seemed to shrink. Every eye was on her, waiting to see how she would react. Should she reveal who she really was? Should she let them know the power she held? Or would that only fuel their anger, turning a scene of mockery into something far worse? Her mind raced back to moments she had lived through before. The lectures from elders about keeping her head down, and the warnings that no matter how successful she became, she would always be judged first by the color of her skin. And now, here it was again, unfolding in public view. She held her ground, refusing to shrink under their laughter, but inside, the storm raged. Every insult, every chuckle, every careless smirk felt like a reminder of a truth she wished wasn't still alive. Respect could be earned 100 times over and still be stripped away in an instant. And just when the tension reached its peak, the laughter seemed unbearable when the air felt too heavy to breathe, something shifted. One of the officers leaned in closer, as if preparing to deliver the final insult. But what he didn't know was that he was standing inches away from making the biggest mistake of his career. Because in the very next moment, the truth about who she was and the power she carried would come crashing down like a hammer. The officer's laughter cut through the air, louder now, sharper, designed to humiliate. He leaned closer, his voice dripping with mock authority. "People like you should know your place." The words landed like a blow, each syllable heavy with centuries of prejudice. Around them, silence spread. No one intervened. No one spoke. Her chest tightened. For a moment, the years of battles, the victories hard won, the robe she wore in the highest courts of the nation, all of it felt invisible. She was stripped down to the single thing they saw, her skin. Every insult was a reminder that in their eyes she was not a judge, not a leader, not even an equal. She was simply a target. But then she stopped retreating. Slowly, deliberately, she straightened her back. The tremor in her hands stilled. She looked the officer square in the eye, her voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "Do you know who I am?" Confusion flickered across his face. The smirk faltered. His colleagues glanced at one another, uncertain. She reached into her bag, not with fear, but with precision, and withdrew her identification. The words on that card, embossed with the seal of the United States, spoke louder than any defense she could give. Federal judge. The room seemed to freeze. The laughter evaporated. The smug grin collapsed into horror. The very people who moments ago mocked her now stood paralyzed, realizing the enormity of their mistake. Their silence was deafening. The power dynamic flipped in an instant, exposing the fragility of the arrogance they had wielded so carelessly. But beneath her steady gaze burnt more than victory. It was anger, sorrow, and exhaustion. Because this wasn't about a single humiliation. This was about how quickly respect could vanish, how easily dignity could be stripped away, and how deeply racism still cut, even for those who had climbed to the highest ranks. And as the officers fumbled for excuses, their voices cracking with sudden regret, she remained silent. Her silence spoke louder than their apologies ever could. In that moment, the truth hung heavy in the air. Authority could command fear, but respect was something they had already thrown away. The question lingered, unspoken but undeniable. If even a federal judge could be mocked and diminished so easily, what did that mean for everyone else who carried the same burden, without the power of a title to protect them? The officers stood frozen, their arrogance shattered, their laughter silenced. Apologies stumbled out of their mouths, but the words felt empty, hollow, too small to erase the sting of what had just happened. For her, the humiliation couldn't be undone. Even as they backtracked, even as they tried to mask their shame, the truth had already been revealed. She left the store without another word, not because she had nothing to say, but because the weight of her silence carried more power than anything they could ever hear. Her footsteps echoed, each one steady and deliberate, reminding herself who she was, not the woman they tried to belittle, but the judge who had earned her place through brilliance and persistence. Yet beneath that steady walk was a deeper ache. Because even after decades of breaking barriers, of proving herself time and time again, she was reminded that to some, her identity would always come before her achievements. That day didn't just leave a mark on those officers. It exposed a reality that stretched far beyond that single encounter. It showed how fragile respect could be when prejudice was allowed to speak louder than truth. It reminded everyone watching that titles, accomplishments, and even power do not shield a person from the sting of racism. For her, the pain wasn't in being mocked. It was in knowing that countless others, without the shield of authority, without the platform of a federal judge, endure far worse in silence every single day. Young men stopped on the sidewalks. Women followed in stores. Families questioned in their own neighborhoods. Their stories may never reach headlines, but they are just as real, just as heavy, just as unjust, and that is why this moment matters. Because it forces us to confront a question we can no longer ignore. If someone at the very top of society can be reduced to nothing in a heartbeat, what hope is left for those who carry no title, no badge, no shield of recognition? Her silence. That day was powerful, but silence cannot be the final answer. It is up to us to speak, to listen, and to challenge the systems that allow mockery, bias, and injustice to thrive. Because this wasn't just the story of a judge humiliated, it is the story of a nation still wrestling with its own reflection. And the real question is this: how many more stories like hers must unfold before we decide that enough is truly enough?